Julian Assange. And one thing I want to say to you today is, it is not only that he is the victim of torture, it is not only that his life is at stake, it is not only we want to save him from a dreadful injustice, we also want to save him because the world needs Julian Assange as a symbol and fighter for liberty in these times.
Okay, that was Craig Murray at the very top, and then those doctors, that was Craig Murray, for the third man as he was being recorded by UC Global back in 2017. The speech at the top was taken at St. Pancras Church in November of 2019 on the eve of the first leg of the show trial of Julian Assange, which I attended along with Craig Murray. Craig Murray today, I'm Randy Credico, by the way. Randy Credico live on the fly here with a special edition of Assange Countdown to Freedom. We are back. This is season 8, episode 1. It's our 5-year anniversary 2 weeks ago with John Pilger. Today we have Craig Murray. There is nobody that I know who has been a closer ally of Julian Assange over the past 12 years than Craig Murray. Craig Murray is a close friend. He's visited him many times. He's spoken out fervently out in front of the embassy. He's has written extensively articles, and he's covered the trial of Julian Assange, this Kafkaesque show trial. And so he's the perfect person. He's been on our show many times, and it's always a pleasure to have Craig Murray on. This is, by the way, is a special for the Progressive Radio Network here in New York City. So what we're going to do is take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Ambassador Craig Murray.
When I was young, it seemed that life was so wonderful, a miracle. Oh, it was beautiful, magical, and all the birds in the trees they be singing so happily, oh joyfully, oh playfully, watching me. But then they sent me away to teach me how to be sensible, logical.
Okay, that was Logical Song. I'm Randy Credico here on Progressive Radio Network with a special edition of Assange Countdown to Freedom with the former ambassador to Uzbekistan, human rights crusader, historian, author, a man of many talents, and that is the great Craig Murray. It's great to have you back on the show, Craig.
Thank you, Randy. Very kind of you to invite me again.
Oh, I'd have you on every week if I could find you, but you know, you're a busy man, and I want to begin when people talk about you being a ex-diplomat or ambassador to Uzbekistan. I'm looking at your bio today. You spent a lot of time at the FCO, the the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, many years. I mean, you started way back in 85, 86. Am I right?
Yeah, 84, in fact, I started. Yeah, no, I worked there for 22 years as a diplomat, and had a great many jobs. I was a professional career diplomat.
And when you went in, Craig, I know how you left by exposing the crimes against humanity, the torture by the U.S. and I guess the U.K. in supporting the Karimov government, Uzbekistan, and you got sacked after that. But going back, I'm looking at you in West Africa and in Poland. you were in Poland at a significant point in time. I think in 95, 96, you were there as they were entering the EU, and I think at that point they may have been in NATO. What was your, when you first went in, were you idealistic? Did you think that you could make a difference at the time, or did you support British foreign policy? What was your thinking at the outset of your career at the FCO?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I suppose I broadly supported British foreign policy, though not in all respects. And in fact, the very first job I had in the FCO, the first position I was given, was in London as the desk officer for South Africa. My designation was South Africa brackets political. And I was dealing with South Africa, we're talking 1984, 1985, at the height of apartheid, when Nelson Mandela was in prison. And the position of the Thatcher government, for which I was working, was that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist and was quite rightly in jail. And I dealt every day with Foreign Office ministers and with 10 Downing Street while Thatcher was Prime Minister. And I have no doubt at all that Thatcher basically supported apartheid. She was pulled back a little bit from that position by her ministers and party, because it wasn't even then quite respectable to support apartheid, but she basically did. And British businesses certainly supported apartheid and were making a lot of money out of it, which very much influenced the position of the Conservative Party. So in my very first job, I was working with a government policy which I profoundly disagreed with. In fact, we weren't allowed, for example, to talk to the ANC, the African National Congress, now the governing party of South Africa. That was viewed by the British government as a terrorist organization. We weren't allowed to have any contact with them. What we did, in fact, was to speak to, for example, the trade unions, which were in fact part of the ANC, but we could argue that they weren't. And that's how I first met Cyril Ramaphosa, the president now of South Africa, in the days when he was a young firebrand communist trade unionist activist. And I met him at a conference in Angola, I think, and managed to talk to him. And this was kind of a secret thing, if you like, that the Foreign Office was doing without telling Downing Street it was going on. We were opening up lines of communication to the ANC without Thatcher being fully aware of that. So that was my very first job in the FCO, and it was quite difficult. And I should explain, because this probably sounds very strange to American listeners. We have an apolitical civil service where only at the very, very top level, and even then hardly anybody changes in the administration. So, for example, I was working in the equivalent of your State Department. If you changed from Conservative to Labour government, none of the staff would change. You'd still work with the same diplomats, with the same ambassadors. Our ambassadors are career ambassadors, not political appointments. There are occasionally a few exceptions to this. But the idea is that you agree as a civil servant to work for whoever is the government. You're not expected to agree with them. That's not part of the deal. And so that's how I ended up working on South Africa, dealing with apartheid at a time when the Prime Minister effectively supported apartheid, and at the same time we were kind of quietly subverting it. It was really quite an interesting thing.
Were there people outside of yourself that had progressive thoughts and progressive policies that they wanted to implement not just there, but in other places, regarding British foreign policy? Or did most people just go along with the program?
Most people would happily go along with whatever the program was of the government in charge. I mean, most people didn't see it as part of their job to try to influence policy. They just saw it as part of their job, as a job to implement policy. And I suppose you could say, in a sense, it was a more ambitious people who would be actively trying to push for policy in one direction or another, and to steer ministers in a certain direction. And I'm certainly in that group of people who, throughout my career, was always trying to influence the policy and persuade ministers of what of what I felt they should be doing.
Well, and you moved. I mean, you moved up the ladder. You kept moving up the ladder, so you were under the radar before up until 2002. I guess you worked under the radar, and the way I read it, and reading your book, Murder at Samarkand, and Catholic Orangemen in Togo, or with Lagos, or whatever. I read that. I mean, you're looking at things, you're trying to influence things, but you keep moving up the ladder. And I suppose people were not aware of where your political leanings were during that period of time. Especially, let me just go to Poland. You were there before they joined the EU, and what were your thoughts about Poland joining NATO and the EU, and at that time? And do you think it was a dangerous precedent to set?
No, I was quite in favour of Poland joining the EU. I still am in favour of Poland joining the EU. I always thought the eastward expansion of NATO was unwise and unnecessary. I mean, we should have been disbanding NATO at that time in the mid-1990s, not expanding it. It should have been being wound up, because its raison d'etre had disappeared. The Cold War had gone. But Poland's membership of the European Union, and in fact, a general European Union project of economically integrating Europe in order to, firstly, provide a larger economic market which would enable greater prosperity in general, and secondly, making European economic interests come together to reduce the risk of conflict in Europe. That was something which I very much supported, and still do, really. I mean, there's several things about the European Union which I don't support. I think that in some, it's made some misturns along the way, but broadly, it's an organization which I think does good in the world. But my job in Poland was my specific job in Poland. I was first secretary in the embassy, and my specific brief was EU enlargement. It was getting Poland into the European Union. And that, again, funnily enough, was rather difficult, because when I started that job, we had still a conservative government in power in London, which was very suspicious of Poland joining, and which worried about the effects on immigration, about how many Polish people might move to the United Kingdom were Poland to join the European Union. One of the things I was tasked with doing was a report for the Treasury and the Home Office and other government departments at home, analysing what I thought were the likely immigration effects on how many Poles might come to the UK. And there were some fascinating things about doing that. One of the things which worried the Home Office were the number of Roma people in Poland, and whether the Roma community might decamp en masse to the UK. And I had a meeting, which I'll never forget, with the Roma community, who it's politically incorrect nowadays to use the term gypsy, but the leadership of the Roma community in Poland referred to themselves in English as the Gypsy Kings. There were 7 of them, and I had a meeting with them actually inside the territory of the Auschwitz concentration camp, because when the Roma people had been liberated from Auschwitz, the ensuing communist regime in Poland, which took over after 45, 46, rather than resettle them anywhere else, literally resettled them still within Auschwitz concentration camp, within the bounds of the original camp. So I had a meeting with their leading representatives actually within Auschwitz to discuss their attitude to immigration, their attitude to moving to the UK if they had the opportunity, and that was one of the stranger nights of my life. I can't pretend it was the best negotiation, because it started off with a massive session of vodka drinking by everybody, which I had to take part in.
That's potato vodka. It's not even grain vodka, right? It's very strong.
It was very strong vodka, certainly, and we drank plenty of it. They were lovely people, extremely hospitable. But to be there, and it just happened to be this extremely foggy, dark night, and I remember going, through to not the tourist area. It's awful to say a tourist area of a concentration camp. I'm afraid at Auschwitz nowadays there is an element of that there. There's the famous gate people go. It was a different area of the German camp, because it's really very extensive. But I remember going to that in the absolute dark, with fog everywhere, and with sort of orange sodium light, and it was hellish, which seemed very appropriate as you entered. It was a very, very strange experience that stayed with me.
Well, there was a documentary I saw when I was in 6th grade. They made us all watch it, and I'm glad I did, about the Holocaust, and it was called Night and Fog, and a lot of it took place in Auschwitz, so I guess it's a very foggy environment. So you went from there, and you keep moving up the ladder. You got this great position in Nigeria, which is all chronicled in your book, The Catholic Orangeman in Togo. Am I right? I don't have it in front of me. And people should get that book if they can. And they should get your other books, Murder in Samarkand, and of course, the one on Burns, which is called the Secundus Burns, which is your epic and a classic book that you wrote after you were sacked. So I want to go from that, going from Poland to West Africa. Now you're going up. Now they said, all right, let's put him in this very pivotal point after 9/11, which was Uzbekistan. So when you went there, what was your mission, did you think? And when did you, when was there some kind of crossing the Rubicon in Uzbekistan?
Well, I was viewed, when I was in Ghana as Deputy High Commissioner, I'd helped organize, had a major part in organizing and influencing the elections in 2000. The British government really wanted to get Jerry Rawlings out of power. Jerry Rawlings had been in power initially as a dictator and latterly as an elected leader, although the elections were a bit dodgy. But he'd been in power for 20-odd years, and the British government were very keen to see the back of him. And had then organised and paid for broadly the elections. But there's an element of the colour revolution about this. There was an awful lot of British government organisation into the actual elections. There was a lot of priming of NGOs and radio stations and others in order to achieve the result of the 2000 election, which was to get rid of Jerry Rawlings and bring in a party called the NPP with John Kufuor. I actually don't think that was a bad thing. I think that did well for Ghana. And Ghana under Kufuor achieved spectacular economic growth. I think they averaged 7% a year for 8 years. Huge increase in the standard of living, big increase in education, very successful. And at the end of his term, Kufuor retired according to the constitution, which is almost unheard of in Africa. So that was but anyway, I was very involved in that. That was viewed as very successful, and so I was chosen for Uzbekistan on the basis of my reputation for getting rid of dictators, if you like, for being somebody who would be very good with a democratization agenda. That was the basis on which Robin Cook decided to send me to Uzbekistan, and it was Robin Cook's decision when he was Foreign Secretary. Unfortunately, that appointment was made in August. You're appointed, but then there's another year or so before you actually go, or more. And in the meantime, you do various training. And I had to learn Russian. I was learning Russian full time. But the appointment was made in the August. And then, of course, the next month, 9/11 happened. And so the entire agenda changed. By the time I got to Uzbekistan, having been selected to get rid of the dictatorship, they decided the dictator had become our great ally in the war on terror. And the brief had shifted to propping up the dictatorship. And I wasn't very intellectually or emotionally suited to the role of supporting a repressive dictatorship. It's just not something I was going to do very well. And that really was, I guess, what led to the conflict in the end of my career, in the sense that had 9/11 already happened at the time the appointment was made, and had it been clear that we were going to ally with this brutal dictatorship and do everything to support it, they wouldn't have appointed me to the job.
Robin Cook wasn't there at that point. It was Jack.
Yeah, Robin Cook was got rid of by Tony Blair for insufficient enthusiasm about the war on terror. And of course, Robin Cook opposed the war in Iraq. So Tony Blair got rid of him as Foreign Secretary for that reason. But Robin was still in place at the time my appointment was made.
Yeah, well, so now that's over. You spent it. The book. You got to read this book, folks. It's called Murder Samarkand, and it's written in 2000. It's a memoir of your days in Uzbekistan, and it really is it's an incredible book, and it's a page turner. And I must say, on a lighter note, I read the book and I kept like looking at these dinners where there was this stuff called plov served. And when I visited you in 2017, I finally had plov, and I'm addicted to it. All right, that's a lighter note. What we're going to do right now, folks, is we're going to take a quick break and get back and talk about Julian Assange. I'm Randy Credico, live on the fly, Assange Countdown to Freedom. We're talking to human rights crusader, journalist, historian, ex-diplomat, UK diplomat, Craig Murray. I think since this music is banned now in most places in the U.S., anything that's Russian seems to be banned in the U.S. Nobody's playing anything, but I'm going to take a quick break. Here's a little Shostakovich, and we'll be right back with Craig Murray, if we have that little piece. Okay, that's a sweep by Shostakovich. Let me ask you a question, Craig. There seems to be a lot of hysteria going on right now. I've read your views on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Some people say the Ukraine, but it's Ukraine, and you get a lot of different views on it. Although you don't get to see the different views on it. As a diplomat, someone that knows the area, I'm trying to get a sense of what is going on and how it happened and how you view it.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that this was always going to happen. In a sense, for Ukraine was always likely to be the conflict area. In fact, we were talking earlier about when I'd been working in the embassy in Poland in the mid-1990s, dealing with Polish entry to the European Union, and when I became ambassador to Uzbekistan after 9/11. When I became ambassador to Uzbekistan, I had in fact applied to be ambassador to the Ukraine. And in my application, I'd said that I wanted to be ambassador to Ukraine because that was the pivot of Europe and would be the pivot of history in the near future. And that Polish membership of the European Union looked secure. Poland was going to, join the EU with no difficulty. But that which way Ukraine would go appeared very uncertain, and that managing Ukraine's foreign relations and managing the West's relationship with Ukraine was going to be the most important question of the first half of the 21st century. So this was always predictable in a sense.
Wait a second. Predictable to you way back?
Yeah. From the mid-1990s, it was predictable that this is where conflict was going to come, because EU expansion into the Baltic states and into Poland wasn't really controversial. But neither had the EU any intention of stopping. And whether Ukraine would eventually be absorbed into the West, if you like, was always going to be the conflict point, and that was fairly plain. And I should say I'm not claiming any enormous personal prescience. This was generally accepted in diplomatic discourse, if you see what I mean. We would have meetings and discuss this in Whitehall when I would come back from Poland in the mid-1990s. That the conflict of Ukraine, whether it would go into a pro-Russian or pro-EU, was the big coming question. So I'm not claiming I was the only one who saw that by any means, but it is extraordinary in a sense that something which so obviously for decades was going to come to a crunch point was allowed to drift into war and not handled much more sensibly and managed much more sensibly by the diplomats to avoid this terrible violence and death and destruction. And I think that's extremely sad. And I think you can look at certain moments of what went wrong. I think one thing that went wrong was the failure of the West to put any muscle behind trying to persuade Ukraine to honor the Minsk agreements, because that at one stage seemed to be the best way forward to resolve the situation. I think sadly we're past that now. I can't see us ever going back to the Minsk agreements. I think Putin's annexation of Crimea and of small parts of eastern Ukraine in 2014 was a huge mistake. If you look at what had happened prior to that, you'd had this intense political competition between Ukraine and Russia to control the Ukraine. And you'd had governments which veered one way or the other way, elected. In 2014, you had a coup against the elected government, based on the fact that but it shouldn't be forgotten, what caused that coup was that Ukraine had signed an association agreement, or was about to sign an association agreement with the European Union, and that Putin called, I think it was Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president at the time, flew him to Moscow and persuaded him to tear up the EU agreement and sign an agreement with Russia instead. That's actually what precipitated the coup, which was huge public anger, certainly in Western Ukraine, at that. And then the reaction to that coup was for Putin to annex small parts of Ukraine. I think that was a huge mistake by Putin, because who's to say that the government installed by that coup would have prevailed long term had it not been for that annexation? You know, the political balance, before Putin invaded the Crimea, the political balance in Ukraine as a whole was still pretty close to 50-50, being pro-Ukraine, EU, and pro-Russia. Wait 2-3 more years, the next economic collapse, the next bad bout of inflation, the next hard winter, the next bad harvest could have led to the political pendulum swinging back towards Moscow again. But once in 2014 there'd been a resort to force, that alienated a huge amount of Putin's support in Ukraine as a whole, dropped enormously as a result to his annexing small parts of Ukraine in 2014. That was a huge strategic blunder by Putin. Yes, he gained the Crimea, he gained Sevastopol, but he lost the rest of Ukraine. Politically, he lost it. His support was pro-Russian sentiment in the rest of Ukraine was enormously damaged. So,
well, what was he supposed to do? Let me ask you a question. You've got this expansion of NATO to 15, 16, 17 countries. All these countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact are now part of NATO, and they're getting closer and closer. I'm not defending the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine. I'm just trying to get a sense of, if I were a Russian and I keep seeing the West expanding and NATO expanding, what's your response to that? I mean, if Russia were to put weapons into Canada, Mexico, Cuba, Puerto Rico, you know, I think there'd be a lot of pushback here. And that's the arguments that you hear. And I don't know. I really don't know what exactly, you know, the formula is here to resolve this expansion of NATO at that time, even the EU. But there must be a lot of fear in Russia about this expansion eastward.
I think there has been the eastward expansion of NATO was too triumphalist, if you like, and wasn't accompanied by what needed to be done, was a continual updating of the existing agreements on conventional weapons limitations. You know, there was this whole arms control mechanism in place during the Cold War, which needed to be updated. And then the expansion of NATO should have been accompanied by continuing agreements with Russia on limits on what weapons were placed in which area. But NATO wasn't willing to do that. And that was a mistake. Having said that, it's a simple nonsense, it's absolute nonsense, to say that Ukraine would have been admitted to NATO. There's no way that NATO was ever going to admit a country with a territorial dispute with Russia. Exactly the same as Georgia. Georgia had been trying, and Ukraine wasn't even really trying to join NATO, frankly, before. Georgia's been trying very hard to join NATO, but because of the territorial dispute over South Ossetia, NATO was never going to allow a country with a territorial dispute with Russia to join NATO, because you're essentially involving yourself in the war. You know, if Ukraine were now a NATO member, NATO members would be obliged to declare war on Russia. That's why Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And people who say, well, Russia had to invade Ukraine to prevent Ukraine joining NATO, that's complete and utter nonsense. NATO was never going to allow Ukraine to join. It may now, because Russia has really messed it up in geostrategic terms in a big way. The world has changed. All bets are off. I still think that Germany and France in particular would be much too sensible to allow Ukraine into NATO, but it's now within the bounds of possibility. Whereas before it was simply diplomatically impossible that it would happen.
Do you think Sweden and Finland are going to join NATO?
Again, I fear it's possible. I don't think it's nearly as certain as the media try to make out. I think that's a major step forward for those countries. And Finland, in particular, would be ill-advised to have a very poor relationship with Russia, simply because it is economically so integrated with Russia. If you're in St. Petersburg, a very short drive, and you're in Finland. It would be peculiar, and Sweden has such a historical attachment to fake neutrality. They were very much fully integrated part of the Nazi economy, but they were officially neutral in the Second World War. So I should be surprised. I should be surprised if Sweden joins NATO. But again, it's become possible. Really, there's not one of the things complained of. If the problem was, if you accept that the problem was NATO expansion and the problem was forward placing of NATO armies and NATO missiles, then Putin's action has made that far worse, because he has, unless we're very lucky, Putin has accelerated NATO expansion and hypercharged it in a way that would have been impossible before. There's much to be said about the morality and legality of Putin's action. But more important than that, it's stupid. He's not actually going to achieve any of his aims. It's going to make NATO even more stronger, even more aggressive, and justify. We're all being sold, we're being told by politicians we need to shell out yet more of our tax money to the military-industrial complex now. NATO spending budgets are going to go through the roof at the expense of the poor, suffering, ordinary people of the West. We're now going to have even bigger scams of defense contractors taking all our money as a result of Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. It's completely and utterly crazy. As I say, if you do accept the premise that Russia is acting because of its fears of NATO expansion, all it's done is make everything much, much worse.
$33 billion President Biden has requested from Congress for aid, military aid. I mean, we just delivered $800 million, which is only like 2% of what he's asking for now. How dangerous is that? I mean, how does someone like Putin look at that? Is that an act of war? Have we actually joined Ukraine by dumping now $33 billion into defensive weapons, offensive weapons into Ukraine?
These are interesting questions. By the law of war, Russia would be entitled to attack shipments of arms on the way. If on the seas, for example, that should be perfectly. If a ship is carrying weapons to Ukraine, to be used in the war against Russia, Russia is entitled to sink that ship at sea. That's not a war crime. That's actually a legal act of war. That's the way wars expand. This is all incredibly risky. And of course, when you're playing with nuclear weapons, this risks the death and destruction of all of us. So the whole thing is utterly mad. I mean, my own view is that Putin's invasion was not necessary in any sense. It's utterly unjustified. It's just all invasions are always defensive. We were told that we were invading Iraq to defend ourselves against Saddam Hussein, for God's sake. And now Putin's invading Ukraine to defend himself against the West. Everybody who launches an invasion of another country always claims it's defensive. Hitler claimed he was attacked by Poland when he invaded Poland.
That radio station, right?
Yeah, all invasions are always claimed to be defensive. We've now got into a war where nobody is seriously trying to find peace. There appears to be no motivation to actually stop a war. It's very easy to sketch out the kind of peace settlement that could be reached.
What is that, Greg? What could we do right now to end this? Because there's a lot of talk about using nuclear weapons at this point. And I think if you push someone against the wall and the person is paranoid and they have control over nuclear weapons, just one, that's it. That's it for the planet. You just use one of these modern nuclear weapons. This is not Hiroshima.
Yeah. No, I quite agree. It looks to me, if you're going to have a peace settlement which ends this war relatively quickly, then some of the outlines of it are obvious. And probably the first and most important aspect of that would be recognition of Russian ownership of the Crimea. And I think that would give Putin something which he could claim he had won. He's got the Crimea, and you would probably have to balance that by Russia recognizing Ukrainian ownership of the Donbass, and then you'd probably need a population swap. That kind of thing would be the outline for a peace deal. And it makes sense because in practice, Russia has the Crimea. And Ukraine's not going to get the Crimea back, short of a conflict that's going to kill literally millions of people. Ukraine is not going to be able to reconquer the Crimea because Russia regards it as part of mainland Russia, and that would lead to a much, much wider conflict. So it makes sense now to be looking at that kind of trade-off, that kind of diplomatic solution. And these are the discussions that should be going on. But unfortunately, nationalism is a terrible thing once roused to blood and national xenophobia. So populations aren't looking to compromise, and politicians aren't looking to compromise because the politicians aren't dying. And of course, arms companies are making billions and billions in profit. So the interests of big capital and big business aren't interested in compromise. And of course, on the Russian side as well, this is good for the Russian military and the Russian arms complex. The same things apply there. So I don't see any chance, unfortunately, of a peace deal being reached because the goodwill isn't there to do so. And I think, in fact, we will end up eventually with a frozen conflict, simply where exhaustion eventually will take over, and you'll have ceasefire lines, which will be much worse for Ukraine, almost certainly, than if they were now to concede Russian ownership of Crimea. But But that will then be unresolved, and if we just end up with ceasefire lines, that will then be an unresolved border for decades going forward, and it means we probably won't get rid of the sanctions against Russia and all the economic dislocations of the world that is causing. This is all extremely difficult and extremely regrettable, and there are no good guys. People who think Putin is a good guy are mad. People who think Biden is a good guy are mad. These are very powerful, corrupt, nasty people pursuing vicious self-interest. There are no good guys in charge on any side.
Yeah, I don't. There really is not someone. There's no statesman here. It appears. Biden is totally controlled by military interests in this country. Goes out, as I said earlier, $33 billion, and I'm sure the same thing in Russia. Although Russia has like maybe 20% of our military budget, but there's a lot of money to be made. I just don't understand that thirst for capital, money, and power. Why it's so bad that they're willing to risk a nuclear conflict, which of course is the end of the world. There's cooler heads have got to prevail here.
You would hope so. It seems remarkably complacent. People don't seem to realize that escalation into nuclear war can happen very quickly, very, very quickly. It could happen within any given 24 hours now. Things could just go very wrong. And it's extraordinary to me the world is so complacent. This is the most dangerous moment of my lifetime, I think. It's much more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's an actual hot war going on here where the United States is fighting Russia by proxy. And even with some US citizens actively fighting in the trenches and with huge amounts of material being supplied to Ukraine in order to enable it to fight Russia, this is a very hot war. And while I feel somewhat vindicated, because I've tried to tell people for years that the Russian threat is exaggerated and that Russian conventional forces are not that strong, because Russia is just not economically powerful enough to have very strong conventional forces. And they're proving not to be that strong. They haven't been able to roll over Ukraine in the way that some people thought that they would. But Russia's nuclear arsenal is very strong. That's where Russia's military strength lies. And in demonstrating that, if you like, in triumphing in the destruction of Russia's conventional forces, you really are pushing them to use nuclear forces. I think this is extraordinarily dangerous and perfectly mad. It seems to me this is behavior as irresponsible as it is possible to be for a politician.
I agree. We're talking with Craig Murray, former UK diplomat, ambassador to Uzbekistan, human rights crusader. I'm Randy Credico. This is Randy Credico Live on the Fly, a special edition of Assange Countdown to Freedom, making our comeback after 2 or 3 week layoff. We're going to play some Scottish music here by Beethoven. I don't know if you're aware of this. I played it for your friend Hugh Kerr 4 or 5 years ago. I wasn't aware of this music until I looked it up. And we'll be right back. And I want to move the conversation to Julian Assange. Well, have you heard that music before, Craig?
Yeah, I've got it on a CD behind me somewhere. I still have not got rid of my CDs yet. It's fascinating the way technology overtakes us as the years go by. And you go from vinyl to cassette to CD, and now, of course, everything can just be streamed, and you don't need to possess anything at all. But yeah, no, I do have that music.
Scottish dances. I mean, have you heard it out in concert outside of the vinyl?
No, I've never heard them performed. I must say the Scottish influence on them is pretty hard to discern, and I think there are one or two of them which have a kind of recognizable Scottish source material, but most of them don't actually sound very Scottish at all. But anyway, who knows? I know Beethoven never came here. If you want, if you like, famous classical composers doing Scottish, Mendelssohn's Scottish Fantasy for violin is a very nice piece, and that is much more based on traditional Scottish songs, including Scots Wha Hae. And Mendelssohn actually came here and researched it. And the other thing, which I may have told you before, but which is insufficiently known, is that the great Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg was, of course, of Scottish ancestry, and his great-grandfather, I believe it was, Edward Grieg, because there is no Norwegian name, Grieg. And his great-grandfather, Edward Grieg, fought at the Battle of Culloden and escaped afterwards to Poland. And the family then lived around the Baltic for 2 or 3 generations. And as used to be very common, still is to some extent in Scottish families, the eldest son was always named after the father. And so there were I think, from the Edward Grieg who fought at Culloden, there were then, I think, 2 other Edward Greigs in between before you get to Edvard Grieg living in Norway. But he was a descendant of a Scottish Jacobite fighter and is, of course, Norway's national composer.
I saw that battle in The Outlanders. Did you watch The Outlanders?
I watched bits of it, but Nadir is very fond of it. She's watched all of it. I watched pieces of it. Let me put it that way.
Right. All right. What we're going to do right now, Craig, because I want to talk to you about your case. I want to talk about Julian Assange. I have to say goodbye to those on the Progressive Radio Network. But before I do, I just want, I know that you have your own legal battles ahead of you. You spent 4 or 5 months in jail. You were framed. You had your own Kafka-esque experience. And now you're looking to appeal your conviction with the, I think it's the European Human Rights Court. Is that where it's going?
Yeah, we're going to go to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg.
So, I mean, this has got to be a very expensive, experience for you. And I know you've exhausted everything fighting the first couple of legs of this over the last couple of years. I just want people to know how they can support this battle and how important it is. Can you just tell us that in a couple of minutes, Craig, before we take another break?
Yeah, okay. Well, I was convicted of contempt of court for my reporting of a legal case in which an attempt was made to frame, to fit up Alex Salmond, the former leader of the Scottish National Party and fighter for Scottish independence. An attempt was made to frame him on false charges of sexual allegations. The jury heard 12 charges of sexual allegations, and they found him not guilty on all counts. He was not guilty on all counts. I had seen evidence that this was a fit-up, basically, by the current Scottish government. And I published some of that evidence. And I published details of his defense case, which showed that, you know, many of the witnesses were simply lying in their evidence against him, which the jury obviously believed too, because they found him not guilty. And I was then, so for publishing this, I was found by the judges guilty of contempt of court for something called jigsaw identification. We believe I'm the only person in the world ever to be jailed for jigsaw identification, which is what the judges said was, if you read everything I'd written together with other information in the public domain, you might be able to identify some of the complainants whose identities were withheld. I don't think that's true. You know, I was very careful not to reveal identities. And of course, I can't know every other single piece of information that's out there in the world. And the notion that I can is daft. But anyway, I was jailed for that. And among the things the judges said was that if I'd been a journalist, I'd be protected. But I'm only a blogger, not a journalist. That I have a lesser status than people employed by the mainstream media, and that goes contrary to previous judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, which says that bloggers do enjoy the freedom of speech protections that journalists enjoy, and others. So we're appealing this to the European Court of Human Rights at the moment, and it's a very important case, I believe, for internet freedom. You know, the idea that freedom of speech doesn't apply on the internet unless you're an accredited journalist working for a billionaire who owns a newspaper or television station. The idea that, you know, they are more ethical, as the judgment said, than bloggers is utter nonsense. So we're fighting this. So far, unfortunately, you know, the case has cost something like $300,000 to date. And we need to raise probably another couple of $100,000 to get it to the European Court. The public have been fantastic in support. If you go to my website, craigmurray.org.uk, craigmurray.org.uk, you can make a donation there to help the fight going forward.
It's right there on because I was at your site today, and I know there's it says support your work. Is that something different than the legal case? If they go to your website, it says support Craig Murray's work as a journalist. You can donate there. Is that the same spot where people can make donations to your defense fund?
Yeah, the supporting the work thing is normally for a monthly subscription, whereas the defense fund allows you to make a one-off payment. If you Google Craig Murray Defense Fund or search for it on the site, you'll find the Defense Fund. Remember, from my American friends, spell defense with a C, not an S, when you do that, and you will you'll discover the Defense Fund where you can make a one-off payment.
All right, but it's also you can find it on your website as well.
That's all on my website, and if people prefer to make a monthly subscription, that's even better.
All right, so you do that at craigmurray.org.uk, and I really urge, this is a major case, and I'm sure that the people associated with Julian Assange will be very enthusiastic in supporting you for all of the work that you've done for Julian Assange over the years. Nobody has put out more than you have, and I mean nobody. There are other great writers, but I mean, your daily dispatches from every single proceeding that took place, with the exception of one when you were in prison. I think that's the reason why you went to prison, so you couldn't cover that one in October. Craig Murray is in a league of his own. So I urge you to go to craigmurray.uk. I mean, craigmurray.uk.org. Is that the exact? Is that it?
craigmurray.org.uk.
craigmurray.org.uk. So what we're going to do, because I want to talk about this. Do you have time to talk about Julian Assange? Can we say goodbye? And we'll have this on the website at the Progressive Radio Network the following 10, 12 minutes to talk about Julian Assange. I'm going to say goodbye to the Progressive Radio Network listeners right now, and you can find what's left later on when we have it on the website. I'm Randy Credico, and this is the great Roger Waters. I wish you were here. We're going to take let you folks go there, and we'll come right back with some closing thoughts with Greg Murray.
I wish you were here too. We just two lost souls slipping in a fishbowl, year after year, running over the same old ground. What have we found? The same old fear. And I wish that you were here.
Roger Waters. I'm Randy Credico here at the Progressive Radio Network with a special edition of Assange Countdown to Freedom. And we haven't, in 1 hour, spoken about Julian Assange. And I got to be honest, Craig, his situation, I think right now is more dire than it has been over the 5 years, 6 years that you've been doing this show. Do you concur with that?
I think that's right. In that he as we go through the stages without succeeding in stopping the extradition, it moves ever closer. I think that we have still chances to appeal here, to appeal to the High Court here, which the legal team are working on. But the Home Office here have a record in recent years. In the last 2 or 3 years, the Conservative government has several times acted illegally in terms of deporting people, for example, and then taken on the rap on the knuckles from the court, because the court will say you acted illegally. The court's not going to put the Home Secretary in prison. The danger that Julian could quickly find himself on a flight with a chance, with further chances of appeal, simply cut off by the physical action of flying him out of the country, isn't something I rule out at all. But there's no doubt that there's a kind of depressing inevitability about the legal process. It increasingly feels because the courts appear willing to simply swallow all kinds of absolute nonsense and make illogical judgments and dismiss very reasonable arguments. It seems there's a very definite determination to go along with extraditing Julian. So I agree that things are, if you like, every time we discuss it, things are worse than they were before, because the process has gone further without being stopped.
I mean, you look at all of the scandals involved, whether it be the Crown Prosecutor Service's heavy-handedness with Marian Nye and the Swedish prosecutor, and keeping that bogus charge alive, hanging over his head. And then we go to UC Global, and then we go to the guy from Iceland, Siggy, a multiple sex offender, child abuser, as one of the key witnesses. It just, and then the assassination attempt that was organized by Pompeo, and all. I mean, it's endless. You would think one of these, developments would have some kind of influence on the powers that be, up the chain from the magistrate all the way up to the Supreme Court to Priti Patel, but it seems to the whole thing was written, and they're not changing the script.
Yeah, I mean, it goes on and on. There are just so many things you could cite. The fact that they broke attorney-client privilege by the fact that all of his legal papers done on his extradition case, including all his correspondence with his lawyers and all the papers prepared by his lawyers, were handed over to the CIA after he was taken out of the Ecuadorian embassy. I mean, that in itself would get any other case dismissed. The fact that attorney-client privilege has been breached in that way by the prosecuting government. You've got the fact that the extradition treaty itself, under which he's being extradited, says there can be no political extradition. There are just so many, and there are literally dozens of things that should have stopped this extradition, none of which have. In a sense, you can take heart from this because it shows how scared they are of Julian, and they obviously are terrified of him. That they are scared of him to the extent that they are willing to abandon all their principles and pretty well abandon all pretense of fair process. And abandon all pretense of listening to the arguments. I mean, you and I both saw, legal processes in which a judge was going to hear arguments from the lawyers on a particular point, and she would come into court with her decision written out for her to read out, and she'd have it in her hand before she had heard the arguments, and then just read out the decision she'd been given before. I saw that happen. I literally saw that close up happen from that position perched above in the gallery. There are just so many things wrong here, but it's because WikiLeaks terrified them. And it's not just that what Julian has done terrified them, it's the potential for what he might yet do, because this is an extraordinary man. This is a man who has changed the world already and could change the world further. And at a time when Biden is setting up organizations within the Department of Homeland Security to censor the internet, when Facebook and Twitter are clamping down. I've lost my Facebook page, for example.
I did not know that.
Yeah, no, I've lost my Facebook page. It was actually hacked while I was in jail. I don't know how it was hacked or by whom, but Facebook will do absolutely nothing. We've tried everything you can possibly try. Facebook will do nothing whatsoever to give it back to me. And my tweets and my use of Twitter is extremely heavily suppressed. I've not actually been kicked off Twitter yet. The loss of internet.
Let me just say this. I know that because I follow you on Twitter. You put out tweets that used to get 1,500, 2,000 retweets and 2,000 likes, and I look at them now, and it'd be 150, 180. It's drastic, even though your number's gone up to over 100,000. But there's an algorithm that they've somehow shadow banned your tweets.
No, that's definitely true, and you can look at viewed tweet activity, and it shows impressions, which is basically how many people's timeline Twitter has put that into, and it's showing like 2,000, 3,000. Was before that was routinely showing 200,000 because it would have my own followers plus the followers of the people who retweet. I mean, by a factor of 100 or more. My tweets are being repressed, and with no Facebook and very little Twitter reach, it massively affects traffic to my website. And this is one of these are the corporate gatekeepers, and then you've got the state gatekeepers, and of course the state has lines into Facebook and into Twitter telling them who they want banned, who they want to suppress. Internet freedom seemed to be a great thing 10 years ago. It seemed like the world would be revolutionized by our ability to look up things on the internet. That's closed in, the control of information, so that now you can only see officially approved information. And even things that are perfectly true, they will tell you are not true. Hunter Biden's laptop would be one very good example of that, for example, where we were all told that was Russian disinformation. In fact, it's now accepted by everybody that that was perfectly genuine. And this is the area where I think how we break through from this, how we find new routes around the corporate and state gatekeepers, how we regain internet freedom. I think that's the kind of area where Julian's, where we're scared of Julian, where he's the kind of person with the ability, the technical ability and the intellectual ability to find the way forward on internet freedom in the future.
Well, I got to tell you, Seymour Hersh, who I think you know Seymour Hersh, he many years investigative journalist for the New York Times. They sacked him. Somebody told me, Seymour Hersh said, now that they got him, they're not letting him go. And I don't like to make this analogy to Manuel Noriega, but Noriega had too many secrets on George H.W. Bush and the CIA. And when they got him, they shifted him around from U.S. prison to a French prison to a Panama prison. And he never got to speak to anybody again after that happened. And he believes that now that they've got Julian, they're not letting him go. I mean, I don't like to say that. I don't want to out him for saying it, but I heard from very good sources that's his belief. And he's a very respected journalist. Do you concur with that?
I think that's their intention. The only thing that can break that down really is the power of public opinion, and the power of course, they don't really care what most of the public think about. We live nowadays in what I would call a helix society, where you have a few very wealthy people who make all the decisions, and the rest of us are essentially controlled minions. So they don't care what you or I think, but they do care to some extent what the editor of the Washington Post or the New York Times or CNN thinks. And I think the one thing we have on our side is that there are enough journalists now. It didn't used to be the case, but having thought about it, enough journalists now realize that this is a threat to them too. That if they do this to Julian Assange, they can do it to anybody, in effect. And so we are seeing the, if you like, the non-governmental bits of the liberal establishment, the major human rights NGOs, journalists organizations, and the main liberal newspapers are kind of breaking ranks with their normal political allies. And there's this kind of establishment split gives me some hope for the future. It depends how it goes. I'm still not without hope we'll stop the extradition. If we do get to the United States, then freedom of speech is much more valued in the United States than it is in the United Kingdom. There's much more of a history that resonates with people in the United States of the First Amendment and why it came into being, and the ability of people to speak truth to power, I think, is valued in the States in a way it isn't in the UK. So I don't regard it as hopeless. I mean, I perfectly accept the security services want Julian dead. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. And that I certainly accept. I don't rule out our being able to stop them, and we certainly intend to stop them.
On a final note, Craig, I've been doing this show for over, you were way back in 2016, and we started officially in April of 2017, April 11th, and I it's like I don't know what to do. What is your advice? what can people do at this point in time that feel helpless and hopeless?
Yeah. I think you just have to keep fighting. I think we have to keep struggling, whether it's hopeless or not, if you like. The struggle is the point of it. Freedom exists in being able to put in that fight against the people who are oppressing us. But sometimes that's the only freedom you have, which is your own ability not to accept it. And that's what I do. I mean, that's what got me through months in a high security prison where I was locked into a tiny cell for 23 hours a day. The notion that this is part of the struggle. This is part of fighting, and it's tough and hard, but the struggle is the purpose. And at some stage historically, we will again break through. And there are plenty of us. Nobody is ever alone in the struggle for freedom. There are lots of us out there who are working on it. We don't have the power, but that's the whole point. We are fighting the people who do have the power, and the people who do have the power are almost always unpleasant people, because only unpleasant people want power. You and I don't want to run the country, Randy. If somebody moved in tomorrow and said, "Would you like to be president of the United States?" you would say, "No, I'm far too busy," and I'd rather take the same view. The people who really want to have concentrated power and wealth are not nice people, and they have to be fought. But the struggle is the purpose.
Yeah, lost cause is the only cause is worth fighting. Those people continued fighting in Spain after Guernica, and Spartacus kept fighting in spite of the odds against Marcus Crassus and Pompeo 2,000 years ago. So it is a struggle that 2,400 years ago, that you just have to keep going. And what else is there to do in life but to continue to struggle and try to get that Sisyphean rock over the other side, no matter how many times you run up that hill. Craig Murray, I want to thank you for this extraordinary return of Assange Countdown to Freedom, for giving us this extra time here. I want to thank Kelly Lane down in North Carolina, who is the patient engineer and editor for her great work. And this has been Randy Credico live on the fly on the Progressive Radio Network with a special edition of Assange Countdown to Freedom. I'm not sure. I think we're going to go out with the great Nils Melzer, whose book, The Trial of Julian Assange, I urge everybody to read. And to read Craig Murray's, go back and look at the dispatches at craigmurray.org.uk online, and do please make a donation to his defense fund. It's really vital. Thank you, Craig, once again, and we'll see you next week, folks.